So yesterday, Apple announced the brand new iPhone 12, and it seems like it's got a lot of really cool camera updates, but what does it even mean? What is an f-stop? What does 10-bit mean? What are all the fancy terms that they used? Let's find out. This lens is way more expensive than the phone. I don't want to break the lens. What's up, everyone? I'm the Everyday Dad, and if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. So I am a bit of a camera nerd. I brought these out as props because I don't even need them because I have so many cameras. Being a YouTuber kind of means you turn into a camera nerd at some point along the process. So what I did is I went through the Apple website and I noted all of the cool buzzwords that they use to describe the camera on the new phone. This is my iPhone 11. And so let's just go through and I'm going to basically explain what all of that stuff means. So first off, when we talk about the iPhone 12, one of the cool new things that they talked about is they do have the wide angle and the ultra wide angle lens. All that means is the field of view that you're gonna see from your camera. One of the new updates as opposed to last year's model is the wide angle camera has an f1.6 lens. But what does f1.6 mean? So what an aperture is inside of the lens, there's the iris, right? There's these metal blades that close and open, letting more or less light in on the sensor of the camera, which is this guy right here. See that? That's the sensor. That's very, very basic explanation, and there are plenty of other videos out there if you're looking for what the actual technical definition of an f-stop is. Basically, f1.6 means there will be more light let into the sensor than last year's model, which I believe was a 1.8. It's not gonna be a lot, but every little bit of light means that you do not need to increase your ISO or how much gain you have to put on the sensor to bump it up in low light situations. So being able to have more light in because you have a faster, the lower the number, we call it fast. I don't know why. Camera people, we say weird stuff. So the faster lenses, the more light you get on the sensor, you'll have better capabilities in low light situations, which is a problem with small sensors, right? Big sensors let you have bigger pixels, which do better in low light. Smaller sensors, they need some help. Megapixels aren't everything. It also has optical image stabilization. So they talked about a couple different kinds of stabilization. We'll talk about the next one when we get to the 12 Pro Max, because that has a totally different thing than the 12, the 12 Mini, or the 12 Pro. So optical image stabilization is a lens-based stabilization system, and I don't have one on me right now. But it's where inside of the lens itself, the elements of the lens will move around a little bit to take the shake out when you're using a camera. Now this phone will also have digital image stabilization. Different companies approach it in a little bit different of ways, but what it seems like is they'll crop in on the shot a little bit and use the gyroscopic data that they have from all of the sensors built into the phones, and they'll have a little algorithm that they run. Well, they'll be able to take the shake out too, but being able to combine the two will give you much steadier results. One of the benefits of having optical image stabilization is you can use a slower shutter count, or how fast the picture is actually taken, and that gives you more light. So the longer you can set your exposure, the more light can come in onto the sensor again. So we're getting the benefit of a wider open aperture, and with the optical image stabilization, we'll have the ability to have longer shutter speeds, and that just lets you do even better in low light, because as you're holding it, if it's stable, it takes out those little wiggles. If you have those little movements as you're trying to do a longer exposure, you'll get motion blur in your picture. Nobody wants that. So stabilization gives you the ability to have sharper results when you use longer shutter speeds for longer exposures. And so they talk about bokeh a lot. So what is bokeh, and what is depth control, and what is shallow depth of field? What that means is, and this is gonna be, so we'll talk about bokeh first. Bokeh, you ask 10 different people what it is, you'll get 10 different answers. My definition is, it's the quality of the out of focus shot. So it's not the out of focus area, and you can't really see it here because I just have a flat background, but if I had lights or something out here, you'd be able to see rings and circles inside of those lights, and that's a characteristic of the lens called bokeh. But when they talk about when they're using their LiDAR camera to then have the subject in focus and the background out of focus, that's called a shallow depth of field. And that just means that the focal plane, what's in focus in your picture or video, there's a greater difference between what's in focus and what's out of focus. So right now, if we were outside, you'd be able to see that we're at a pretty shallow depth of field right now. We're at f1.8 on a full frame camera. That's pretty shallow. This is an f1.4 lens on a full frame camera. This would be it would be so shallow it would be distracting. But for photos, it does look a little more professional when you can isolate, but let's see how their new LiDAR technology really works, because it should fix things like, the edge detection. That's one of the problems that phones have, is edge detection. When they do that thing, hopefully the LiDAR camera will be able to fix that. So here's a big one, especially for video shooters. It looks like the new iPhone 12 will have 10-bit video recording. Now, we don't exactly know what kind of a codec Apple's gonna use, and this is gonna be very basic. I don't wanna get into like a data color science argument here, but all that means is there's more information packed into the file. For example, a lot of consumer level cameras and most cell phones will shoot in what's called 8-bit. All that means is there's a certain amount of information that the image processor is capturing from the sensor and then displaying when you present it, on YouTube or whatever. But some cameras and some higher end like hybrid cameras like these cameras and that camera that we're on right now shoot in what's called 10-bit. And that just means there's more information in the files. And what this really gets you from a practical standpoint is, and hopefully again, like I said in yesterday's video, I'm shooting in 10-bit right now just because I'm trying to limit the amount of banding that happens on my background here. And banding is just like concentric circles that you'll see push out from like a light source on a solid background like this, just because there's not the color information, whether you're not capturing it in the camera or you're not processing it when it gets like mauled through YouTube's compression. Where you'll really see this if you're doing video is you'll see it in the sky. The sky is not just one solid color of blue, right? Depending on where the sun is in the sky, there's different levels of blue, but 8-bit can only capture so many differences between the blue, so you'll see big lines in the sky. Well, 10-bit should hopefully give you more information inside of those files to smooth that kind of stuff out. And if you're processing these images after the fact in like your favorite video editing software, 10-bit gives you a little more flexibility to both push colors and sometimes be able to recover shadows and highlights if that's something you're working on. And if you would like a more detailed explanation of this, I highly recommend checking out Gerald Undone's channel. I'll leave him linked in the description below. He will be able to run you through all sorts of technical aspects of all the stuff I'm saying right now. Again, this is just a basic overview of what these terms mean. And then a big one that they didn't specifically say this in the video, but it's something that I'm concerned about and we'll have to see going forward when we actually get our hands on the phone. So there's differences in codecs, right? Generally, we record in H.264, and that works pretty well with most current computer equipment. But there's a newer codec, well, the newest one is H.266, but H.265 is a high efficiency codec, and it saves a lot of space when recording video. And that sounds great, right? Like, hey, we've only got so much space on my phone. I want to be able to save as much of that while keeping as much quality as possible. The problem is most computers right now have issues handling 10-bit H.265 or high efficiency codecs. I imagine we'll be fine using it on Apple Silicon. Apple really has a very good transcoding process built inside of their chipsets. But the rest of computers, I'm curious to see how this will work going forward if you want to edit the iPhone 12 video on another computer, because it looks like it could be kind of rough. What else did we talk about? We talked about color depth, we talked about dynamic range. If you're curious what dynamic range is, as we talk about high dynamic range or how much dynamic range one of these cameras captures, all dynamic range is the difference between the highlights and the shadows. So this scene that you're seeing right now does not have a lot of dynamic range to it. There's just two light sources and the background is just doing whatever. This would be a high dynamic range or contrasty situation if, like, let's say there was a big bright window back here and this light was turned off. So the difference between the shadows and the highlight would be much greater. And then trying to recover that and push those differences together is really where you see a lot of image processing after the fact. And when we talk about dynamic range, that's where it comes in. Now let's talk about the iPhone 12 Pro Max, because there are a few things that the Pro has that the iPhone 12 doesn't have, but the 12 Pro Max is what they threw the kitchen sink at when it comes to their video stuff. So the big difference is when it comes to the Pro Max as opposed to the Pro, when you add the telephoto lens onto here, the telephoto lens on the 12 is 52mm equivalent, while the Pro Max will be 65mm equivalent. And again, like we talked about in the beginning of the video, that just means the difference in the field of view you're gonna see. 65 means it's gonna be tighter, you're gonna be more zoomed in with the Pro Max. But what a longer focal length also does, it doesn't just like zoom in like on a digital like you see on like CSI, it also pushes up, it like compresses the background. So it makes the background smushed together, and that makes it look like a more high quality. That's what you'll see. 85mm is generally used for portraits if you get like your picture professionally taken. And that's why you see like the background's really blurry, it's really smushed together. That longer focal length gives you that. But the two two big things it looks like we're gonna get from the Pro are Apple ProRAW. Now we already talked about video, we talked about dynamic range. One of the things when you take photos from like a bigger expensive camera is you can take raw photos, but what that just means, you're getting the most information that you can out of the camera sensor because the camera's doing no processing to that file. So you're getting everything that the camera sees. If you take a JPEG, the camera's processing that file. So it may look fantastic, and a lot of people just use JPEGs because they look great straight out of camera, but you're not gonna be able to push and pull it as much without the file falling apart because it doesn't have all that information. But one of the benefits that cell phones have is they have these crazy powerful processors built into them, and they can do a lot of computational photography, computational work that this camera can't do because it does not have a processor nearly on the same level as this. And it seems like when you're taking a raw photograph on the phone, you're throwing a lot of the benefit of the phone out the way. You're just throwing it away, all the power you have. Well, Apple ProRAW seems like it's going to try to be a middle ground between compressed files while also having all of the same information. That's going to be very exciting to try out when we can get our hands on it, but that's what my interpretation of what they're talking about with ProRAW means. And then the new cool specific thing to the iPhone 12 Pro Max is what's called sensor shift stabilization. So at the beginning of the video, we talked about optical stabilization, right? Where the lens, the elements of the lens will move around a little bit to take some shake out. Well, what sensor stabilization is what's called in-body image stabilization that you'll hear talked about with cameras. Like the GH5 here has fantastic in-body image stabilization. And that means when you're holding it, the sensor itself moves around in here to take out the shake. So if I use I can't use this because this is a different kind of lens, but if I use a lens that does not have optical image stabilization, it will still be stabilized because the sensor itself moves around in the body. And that's the kind of stabilization that Apple is putting into the 12 Pro Max. The sensor itself will move around and it will have the optical image stabilization built into the lens. So we should see levels of stabilization on the iPhone 12 Pro Max. Wild. That's gonna be some crazy levels of stabilization. I'm really excited to see if Apple can pull it off and make it look like it's on a gimbal, or make it look like we can get exceedingly long exposure times on these cameras. It should be wild. But yeah, this has just been a very quick overview of what the camera terms that Apple used during the release, what they all mean. And if you have any questions, if there's ones that I didn't talk about, leave me a comment below. Obviously I love talking about nerd camera stuff because I have so many of these darn things around the house. Leave me a comment below and we will talk all about it. And if you would like to see my initial thoughts of the iPhone 12 and just kind of go through all of the options with me, here's my video where I do just that. You can click right here. Click, 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 click. Thanks for watching.